We're calling because we'd like to interview you. What? Yeah, we want to interview you. We read about you on Silicon Investor, and we understand that you did really, really well, and we'd like to come out to San Diego and interview you. I said, oh, wow, okay. So they did. They came out and they said, we're going to do a big photo shoot too. So we went to Coronado Del Hotel, which is a famous historic hotel in San Diego, and they set up a big shoot. It took all day. And they basically said, yeah, you're going to be in Money Magazine. I thought, wow, that's wonderful. And so a month later, they called me when it was about to come out, and they said, you're on the cover. I was like, what? You know?
Welcome to the Plan B CRNA podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Jones, and I'm so excited that you're here. The Plan B CRNA podcast is the only show made specifically for nurse anesthetists who are exploring options outside of their traditional career paths. This is the place to expand your mind and your goals as we uncover new ways to produce side income together. Join me for some honest, unscripted discussions with other CRNAs who are transforming their financial lives. This episode is brought to you by On-Call Capital. On-Call Capital is dedicated to educating CRNAs and other healthcare providers about investing outside of the traditional stock market. On-Call Capital also provides opportunities for you, yes, you, to create passive income and generational wealth while also lowering your taxable income through investments in the apartment and alternative investment spaces. If you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure you do that right now so that you don't miss an episode. Thanks so much for joining me today. And now, on with the show. Before we get started, I want to make a quick note that this conversation ran pretty long. There were just so many hidden nuggets that I couldn't bring myself to start cutting stuff out. So instead, I've broken up the discussion into two parts. This is part one, and part two is going to go live next week. Enjoy the show. Welcome to another Provider Spotlight episode of the Plan B CRNA podcast. When I heard our next guest story secondhand, I knew that I had to reach out to learn more. Investing in a little-known company netted him $17 million in profits and a totally different lifestyle. Russ Maiolino started his medical career as an Army medic. He would go on to gain a year of burn medicine ICU experience prior to enrolling and graduating from the Medical College of Pennsylvania, Drexel University. His first CRNA practice was in a community hospital outside of Philadelphia, which offered a lot of autonomy and required a lot of regional skills. Russ later moved to Southern California in 1989 on locum tenens contract with Kaiser Permanente in Hollywood, later continuing the contract at San Diego Kaiser Medical Center. He started with a side gig in anesthesia for plastic surgery, working a 3 to 11 shift at Kaiser and doing cases in plastic surgery during the day. So he worked 16 hours a day roughly for 10 years before hitting it big in the stock market. And boy, do I mean big. Russ ended up on the cover of Money Magazine in March of 2000 in the middle of the dot-com boom. Russ retired at the age of 48 and had fun for 10 years before the bottom fell out of the market, and then the rebuild began. So Russ, welcome to the show today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Bobby. It's good to be here.
So I like to start these things off at the beginning. So let's talk about stock investing. How did you find out about Qualcomm at the time, and when and why did you decide to invest?
Okay, well, my stock market investing started with just a small IRA, which you can only put about $2,000 a year in. So in 1982, after being out of school for 2 years, I opened an IRA, which was a new concept. And so I started with that, and I started with Merrill Lynch as a broker and went into mutual funds because I had no idea about investing. I wanted to learn more, so I bought Money Magazine as my first magazine to try to learn about the stock market. It seemed really on the basic level of comprehension for people who are very green to the market, or not green yet, and started to read more and more about the market. And next thing I know, a stock show called CNBC, which everyone knows about now, came live, and I started watching that when I'd come home from work after a 7 to 3 shift, given anesthesia. It would still be on. I catch a couple hours of it, and fascinated by the ticker tape that you'd see on the bottom of the screen. In the old movies I used to watch when I was a kid, someone would be in front of a bubble ticker taper, reading these ticker tapes, and either they were euphoric of joy, or they just completely broke down and ruined. And I always thought that was fascinating. So now you have the ticker tape on the television. And so that was really unique, and I really started paying attention to that. So you can watch CNBC over the years and learn a lot, watch TV and get smarter. That was unusual for a TV show, to get smart from it. So that was part of my investing beginnings. So what I did was I was in mutual funds, and from 1982 to 87, the market went up from 700 Dow Jones. Now it's 35,000, right? It was 700 then. So the market went up from 700 to 2,200. And one of the things that I had hooked onto was this newsletter that basically followed the Elliott wave theory and sort of put some science in behind the crazy, chaotic movements of the market. And I started reading that market month after month, market letter, and realized, okay, this is very interesting. It seems to have, an affinity for somewhat predicting what may happen. Mm-hmm. So the market letter came out in the month of September of 87, and basically predicted that the market was going to drop huge. So I started reading that and thinking, I better watch out. And so October of 87, I'm watching the market and the difference on how things were moving. And I realized, I think this market letter is really coming together on the market. So we're going to have a big drop. And I'm worried. This is my first exposure to a huge drop that could occur. So Friday of October, I think it was 16th of 1987, I called Merrill Lynch and I said, sell everything. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, I'm selling everything. The market's going to drop. And they're like, well, we don't think you should do that. And I'm like, I want to do it. And so, okay, so they sold everything. And I'm telling the docs that I work with, the surgeons, and some of the anesthesiologists and CRNAs that I work with, hey, the market's going to drop. I just sold everything. And I remember the chief of anesthesia said, you mean you sold everything you owned in the stock market? I said, yeah. I said, I think it's really going to drop. So Monday, the market opened and it was down huge. And they called that Black Monday.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in New Zealand, across the world, that occurred on Tuesday. They called it Black Tuesday. So the market dropped enormous. It dropped about 55%, I think it was.
It was huge. I know people have talked about that. I don't have the statistics right in front of me, but it was a huge drop.
It was a huge drop, and the market had never seen that, even in 1929, which you've often heard about. It never dropped. It didn't drop to that degree percentage-wise. And in New Zealand, it dropped about 80%. So this was a global drop. Around the world, the whole thing dropped. And so here I am. I'm out of the market, looking like a genius, basically because I read this letter and paid attention to it. Who knows if it would have helped really, but it seemed to. And so I figured, well, okay, so I'm out. And what am I going to do now? So I waited 2 weeks and I bought my first common stocks. So this is the first time I'm buying common stocks. I bought like Ford, GM, companies that I was familiar with. And a company called Genentech, which was new in the biosciences, which later grew to be huge. So with that, I then moved to California, Southern California on a contract. And I just wanted to establish myself in California because my daughter was at that point in high school, and I wanted to establish myself as a resident in California, have her come out and go to college there. And so I got this locum tenens job and hooked up with Merrill Lynch in Beverly Hills. and eventually got down to San Diego on a contract. And there I started doing plastic surgery, anesthesia for plastic surgery during the day, and met this Dr. Manchester who was pretty prominent in San Diego as a plastic surgeon. And he gave me a white paper on Qualcomm. And he told me a story. He said, look, I have an investment banker friend who was a rabbi turned investment banker, told me to buy these dairy farms in Mission Valley here in San Diego. And I didn't land there. Yeah. And I didn't do it. And look what's there now. And they put all these malls in. So the land got sold for millions more than he would, right?
Yeah.
So he lost out on that. And then he pointed to Northwest San Diego, which is now called Carmel Valley, but at the time it was called Northwest San Diego. Same thing. You should buy land up there, he's telling them, because that's where the growth is going to go. They're going to build out that area. He didn't pay attention to it. He just, kind of dismissed it. And he basically lost on that. So this time the investment banker came to him and said, look, Qualcomm, this company is going to be something really big someday. You should invest in this. This time he took him serious.
And now, what year was that? What year was this?
This was 1989, 90.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he gave me the white paper on it, and my introduction to cellular technology was a brick phone that I bought probably 6 months prior. I say brick phone because it was the big Motorola ETAC brick phone. It weighed probably about 3 or 4 pounds.
Yeah.
And it was big. Yeah. And but what was unique about it was you could take it anywhere and communicate. So that seems like, well, nothing today, but back then that was something. Cut the cord. You're basically, so at the time this cost about $3,500. And the cost for a call was about $2.20 a minute. So that's the big difference here I'm talking about. So in 2019, that would be about $11,000.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was expensive, but I bought one because I was on call. I could write it off, and I just thought it was cool. And I could go to the beach and not worry about missing a call when I get called in. And the people that had those were successful doctors and businessmen at the time, and that was it. No consumers had that at the time. Every now and then, when my daughter moved out, I would lend it to her. She'd go to the beach, and I felt a lot safer that she had a phone that I can reach her. So I thought, if this ever got to be made smaller and cheaper, which these digital devices, all technology that happens eventually, this is going to be an enormous consumer item, probably the biggest consumer item ever. And so I kind of honed in on that. And when I read the Qualcomm papers, what was unique about Qualcomm was that they were basically creating a digital cellular technology that would transmit phones, converting them from analog into digital. So if you take the CD, where they converted analog vinyl records to CD digitals, that is the equivalent, only wireless telecom. You're going from analog calls to digital. Not to get too crazy into the technology, but in Europe during this time, they already had championed a technology that was based on the same thing, converting to digital, and it was called time division multiple access, or TDMA. Qualcomm came up with a digital technology that was much far superior than that, and it was called CDMA, or code division multiple access. Why I liked CDMA was it sounded like CRNA. Okay?
I like that. Yeah.
It kind of caught me there.
Yeah.
And so the difference was stark. With TDMA, you can only put 3 phone calls into the space of 1 analog call per channel. So if there's 4 channels out there, it's only like 3 calls for one,
Yeah,
or
that's
12
12.
calls
Yeah.
maximum going at the same time. So if you're going up the 405 freeway, busy during rush hour in LA, and you had one of these brick phones, you barely got a call through. I was very lucky to get a call through, right? And so that was TDMA ushered in Europe. And basically, all of Europe had to use that. It was under a mandate. They used like just a technology industry mandate. Their union, telecom union there, basically, who comes up with standards, said this is all what we're using, and we're going to export this around the world and make billions of dollars eventually. Qualcomm upset that whole thing, disrupted it by coming up with the technology a little later than them. Really, a few years later, code division multiple access, which was much smarter. The reason is because it basically broke up the analog, transmitted it into digital bits, and then put it through this pipe where you can get 10 to 20 phone calls into the space of one.
That's a huge difference.
Big difference, right? Later, that became 20 to 40
Mm-hmm.
when they perfected it. And so, what's that mean? How's it work? Well, if you have a cocktail party and you've got couples in the room, each couple speaks a different language. You got people from all over the world. Each couple understands each other, but nobody else, all the other couples don't understand all the other people in the room.
Mm-hmm.
That's how it breaks it up and sends it across the pipe and reassembles it. Mm-hmm. It was genius. To do that, though, you had to have supercomputers for that time that would have to take these bits and restructure them very, very fast on millisecond levels. So you don't have any disruption in voice, and the voice is clear and concise and quality voice. So they said, well, that's not possible. You'll never be able to put this on the market. And what happened was they proved them wrong. They did these test calls. They did have computers that handled it. They kept building bigger and faster computers. And the faster the computers got, the more it was able to handle this technology, right? So Qualcomm was onto something, but they had to convince the industries. And so they went to the carriers in the US and the baby bells, basically, and said, hey, take a look at this. And so they did, and a couple of them adopted it. And once a couple adopted it, others adopted it. So they disrupted the whole thing. They threw out TDMA and brought in CDMA in the US.
Yeah.
Okay. So that is something that I was following. And I was on the very beginning of that, as far as like they were just putting it in these big vans and testing it, because you needed enough, you needed equipment that would fill up a van for one phone to be able to test it, because it wasn't built into a prototype phone yet. And it also had to be compacted down. The white papers that I was reading were early in this. It fascinated me, and I thought, you know what? They have all the patents on this. That was the big thing.
First mover in the industry.
First mover in the industry. They had all the patents. So it's like a drug that gets patents. You basically have that for 17 years. Nobody else can make that but you. Unless you license them, they can make it, and then you get royalties.
Yeah.
So Qualcomm's model with their intellectual property was all these patents. In fact, in their headquarters, they have these huge walls of patents that they have on all this stuff. And my vision for this was, hey, if I buy enough of this stock and keep researching it and adding to it, and as long as they're making and fulfilling the goals and the industry was adopting it, this was going to be the de facto standard in digital telecom eventually around the world. It'll go global. And if that ever happened, then Qualcomm, once it was recognized by the market, which it wasn't yet, because it came out as $15 a share as an IPO, and it basically, it would get up to like $40 and basically not much higher than that for years.
Yeah.
So over a 10-year period, while working plastic surgery part-time
Yeah.
during the day, I would take money every couple of weeks and buy shares. So it was a really good way to do it because you dollar cost averaged.
Yeah.
And I did it over a 10-year period. And I
Yeah.
had,
Over 10 years, you became an overnight millionaire.
yeah, 10 years. Yeah. So 1999, it was like partying, like it's 1999. It shot up 2,600%.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
while that was happening, I would be doing a case,
Mm-hmm.
and I would be aware what was going on the with the stock. And I'd finish a case and go out and look and find out it went up $150 a share. Like
Yeah.
so those days where it was really catapulting up was breathtaking. So
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden, within a couple of days, I was basically a millionaire.
Mm-hmm.
And so during the process of that whole thing, over the years, I was reading papers like Investors Business Daily, Wall Street Journal, and I realized that all these stocks that surged upward, like let's say Walmart, okay, Walmart had a big, huge surge upward, went up several hundreds percent, and then all of a sudden it dropped. And so I realized I had to have an exit strategy. And I always kept that in mind. So here I am, a millionaire now, and I'm realizing, okay, you've gotten there, you've hit your goal. Now, what are you going to do? And so, Alan Greenspan, who was the Fed chief at the time, came out and said something about irrational exuberance, and then the market started crashing.
Yep.
Back then, you had to call and sell over the phone. There was no computer selling. That did come later. And so you had Windows 95, 1999. They didn't get computer brokerages accounts at the time. So you had to call them and sell them. So I couldn't get on the phone fast enough and start selling what they called blocks of stock, or 5,000 shares at the time. Because at the time I had 80,000 shares.
Okay.
What happened was it had split 4-for-1 in 1999, and I ended up with 80,000 shares, and I had to move all that very quickly to get it. So by the time I was able to do that, as the clock was moving in the market that day, things were crashing so badly, I was able to net $12 million.
Wow. Okay.
So, hey, $12 million, and
I don't think I'd be complaining.
yeah, I can't complain. And so at the time, the taxes were pretty high.
Yeah.
So I basically braced myself to give the feds and the state half that.
Mm-hmm.
So it came close to half that. So I ended up clearing about 6 million.
Okay.
And still a $6 million man.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was a really good situation, and so that's the story of Qualcomm.
Okay.
So what happened from there was that during that time, there was a website called Silicon Investors, which I participated in, and my username was Go Qualcomm, or Go QCOM, and I even had a license plate that had that.
I mean, I don't see why you would. I mean, it's not like you made any money off of it or anything.
Yeah, so I was a big cheerleader for Qualcomm, and
Yeah.
I told a lot of people about it, a lot of people, and a lot of people gained a lot that I worked with on it, so it was really wonderful. There were a lot of people who downed it too, and so when I realized the success in it, it was really, really a sweet thing, because a lot of people that I actually worked with did well too with it, and so all of a sudden I get a call in February 2000. Actually, it was late January, and it's Money Magazine. And they called my home and they said, "Hey, this is Money Magazine." I'm thinking, my subscription. They calling about that. No, we're calling because we'd like to interview you. What? Yeah, we want to interview you. We read about you on Silicon Investor, and we understand that you did really, really well, and we'd like to come out to San Diego and interview you. I said, oh, wow, okay. So they did. They came out and they said, we're going to do a big photo shoot too. So we went to Coronado Del Hotel, which is a famous historic hotel in San Diego, and they set up a big shoot. It took all day. And they basically said, yeah, you're going to be in Money Magazine. I thought, wow, that's wonderful. And so a month later, they called me when it was about to come out, and they said, you're on the cover. I was like, what? You know?
Holy smokes.
So yeah, so here it is, Money Magazine. I'm on the cover.
Oh, so cool.
Yeah, and so
For those of you at home, we've got the video on YouTube if you want to see Russ on the cover of Money Magazine here.
yeah,
So
and so then there's the basically the um, big spread that they did.
yeah, very cool. Hitting the jackpot.
Hitting the jackpot.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was amazing. So I had my 15 minutes of fame even.
Yeah.
With
But
that.
that's fascinating though, because I read the story and I saw, how they touched on how much you did invest, but they just said you got in it, near the beginning, but they didn't really give the idea that that was a 10-year process that you
Yes.
went through.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, and you hear about hitting the jackpot,
Yes.
and that makes it sound like you were some kind of an overnight success, and
Yeah.
that kind of, I mean, it denigrates the amount of work and effort and research that you actually put into learning more about this company, making sure of your investment, and the dollar cost averaging thing, which is huge in stock investing.
Yes. Yes, it is. And that's really the only successful way I think that you'll do well in the market is to buy over a long period of time,
Hmm.
because you can never really time the market with real predictability. Even though they have things like the Elliott wave theory, which you can look at, and it helps a little bit.
Yeah.
But yes, a
I'll
lot of
provide a
home.
link to that Elliott wave theory in the show notes as well. That way folks can look into that for themselves. But
Yeah, a lot of homework went into this. A lot of research on my part. So I dug into everything that I could read on digital technology to the point where I could have a conversation with an electrical engineer that did digital telecom
mhm,
technology. Um, and the reason why I know that is because on Silicon Investor, there were a bunch of engineers on there.
yeah,
And, so the conversation that I could hold up, even in a couple parties I went to after that, where there were engineers, electrical engineers on this, was pretty good. I mean, for someone who's not an engineer or in digital technology for telecom, the comprehension behind all that was basically, part of why the success in the stock. Because if it wasn't coming together on a scientific basis, then the faith would have faded.
yeah,
And so I read everything that I could, and there are some big people out there that even recognize that. So George Gilder wrote this book on telecosm, telecosm,
okay,
and he's a brilliant guy, and so he was one of the people that I read on in basically doing all of my research. And another book by Brodsky was Wireless by Aaron Brodsky, and it was all on electrical engineering behind this stuff. And so I'm
wow,
pushing myself through these books like they're medical textbooks.
yeah.
Okay.
Now,
Um,
do you have more of an engineering kind of mind? Because I've found that CRNAs can often be separated into categories of like having that engineering mind, or like me, and I don't. So it takes more effort to understand the mechanics and the things of that nature. Where do you find yourself falling?
I think I'm in the middle, to be honest.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
do have some of that.
Yeah.
I'm not like a real super geek, but I do have a love for technology, and I could figure it out pretty good.
Okay.
But I'm not like someone who's like, that's the line with me, and other things don't work. So I'm kind of, I guess, in the middle with
It's
it.
not a
Some of
natural
it came
kind of.
hard.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, a lot of it actually did come hard to me to understand it, but um, basically, anesthesia is interesting because anesthesia in the stock market, like how does it relate to
Hmm.
a CRNA? I think it relates highly because there are a lot of things in the market that occur, and a lot of charting is done. There's a lot of stock charts. There's a lot of physics in the stock charts. There's a lot of reading science out of these stock charts, um, which if you go to an anesthesia seminar and they throw up a chart on a process where you're giving a drug and you're peripherally constricting the vascular system, or you're picking the heart up with a beta agonist, and you see this on a chart. Well, there's a lot of stock charts that basically have a lot of that in it. So
Yeah.
the DNA for stock market investing is actually pretty akin to the DNA in anesthesia, I believe.
Hmm.
That's how, as an individual at least, I basically felt about the stock market, and often still do find things that are very similar. And then there's the risk aspect of the market. There's the risk aspect of anesthesia. So anesthesia, the DNA comparisons are, you're taking risk on, and you're calibrating that risk, and you're doing things to blunt the risk and make it a successful anesthetic.
Hmm.
You're doing the same thing in the stock market where you're taking risk on, you're doing things to blunt that risk, and you want a successful outcome.
Yeah.
So you can do things that are, they could be very related to anesthesia.
Yeah. Huh. That's and I think that's fascinating because there are so many different types of investments and things that you can tie back to what we do as anesthesia providers. Um,
Yes,
and so that part of it I think is fascinating that anesthesia can actually touch on so many different things. It is a lot more global in nature than some of the other career fields out there. So
yeah,
now you mentioned, when we were talking a little bit earlier that, hey, after, 10 years later, you kind of had this retirement lifestyle for 10 years. So
yeah,
what happened in that interim period when you were retired? And then what happened when the stock market crashed again in '08?
yeah. So you had the stock market tech wreck, basically in 2000,
Hmm.
um, and everything fell. So the dot com boom became the dot com bust, right?
Yes. The bubble
And
burst.
yes, and so you saw companies that basically didn't have any earnings, um, and they basically went away, and they never be heard of again. And so a lot of that happened in telecom, not the telecom, but the dot com
Hmm.
bust. And so here I was out of the market. I had cleared this money. I put it into vehicles, and I went back into Qualcomm with it later, a little later, and I put it into other things that would earn dividends and pay like bond income.
Okay.
And because now I basically said to the CRNA world or anesthesia world, hey, I'm done. I did it. I'm in California. I'm going to enjoy my life. I don't have to work anymore. So, as a CRNA, you have to keep your license up with something of a practice origin, or you lose it, right? You got to have a practice going of some kind. So what I did is I did keep my license for 5 years by doing medical legal stuff in anesthesia,
Okay.
uh, specifically to keep my license.
Yeah.
After 5 years, I was like, well, you know what? This is working great. I really don't need to do this, you know. And honestly, the business was hard to really make a profit in. Um, It was interesting, but it wasn't really a very profitable business.
Okay.
And I just basically did it on a part-time basis to basically keep my license. And so later that would turn out to be a really good thing. But I gave up my license after 5 years. And so in 2005, I gave up my license. I figured I don't need to go back anymore. I'm doing pretty well. And in the meantime, I had also gotten into acting. And so I was going up to Hollywood, and my experience of being a CRNA up in Hollywood, I met a lot of people in the entertainment industry because they put me up in an apartment that was meant for enterprise situations, and they brought people in to act in movies and musicians or whatever, and they all stayed in this building, and I'm in there. I'm the only medical guy.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm in there
That's
with all these
interesting.
entertainers and actors and whatnot. So I'm talking to them. I made friends with some of them, and so I thought, wow, I would like to do that now that I have time. Maybe I could do some acting, and do some medical parts because I got that in my background. Why not try that? And so I went to acting school. I basically did enough where I got a SAG license, Screen Actors Guild,
Yeah, yeah.
which is a union, and also AFTRA, which is another television union.
Okay.
And I was making some commercials. I actually did a TV show, Untold Stories in the Emergency Room, so that's out there. And I wrote for them a little bit too. So the problem was that I had to drive up to Hollywood and then back down to San Diego, which would take about 3 hours each way.
Okay.
Traffic, and you do a 10-minute audition and drive back. So
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot.
yeah. My wife wasn't interested in moving up there. We had children in school, didn't want to move up there.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, well, I got eventually burned out on the drive, and I just figured out I'm not going to do this. But I did enjoy it a lot, and it gave me a lot.
You got to scratch that itch a little bit. That's cool. As I mentioned at the top of the show, this is part one of a two-part conversation. I was so excited about our discussion that I completely forgot to ask Russ how folks could get a hold of him. He has asked for people to find him on Facebook through his personal page and his business page. Both of those links are included in the show notes. The story continues next week, so I hope you'll join us. See you next time on the Plan B CRNA podcast. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Plan B CRNA podcast. If you haven't already subscribed and reviewed the show, I'd be honored if you took the extra time. It really helps to expand our reach and get the word out about the show. If you're a CRNA who is interested in sharing your story on our podcast, I'd love to have you. Please email me at bobby@oncallinvestments.com for more information. This episode was brought to you by On-Call Capital. They are dedicated to helping providers like you develop passive income and generational wealth through investments in the apartment and alternative investment spaces. Feel free to check out their website at www.oncallinvestments.com and subscribe to their free educational email series. You can find On-Call Capital on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also check out our YouTube page, where you'll find all of the show episodes along with other educational videos. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.